Good morning, everybody. It's 9:02, and we'll start the second day of the conference. The day's title for today would be State, Society, and Foreign Policy Making. And this is the first panel. My name is Arie Kacowicz. I'm from the Department of International Relations. I'm the head of the academic committee at the Davis Institute, and I have a long-term relationship with the Davis Institute that I think the last 20 years have been always grateful for the Davis Institute that has helped me along in my research. And I think it's a little jewel that we have here, and we have to take care of the little jewel. So Mr. Davis and Mary Lee, thank you for joining us again. So today we are going to have in the next hour and a half or so, a little more than that, we're going to have a conversation related to the subject of the politics of identity and security. So what I want to do in the next couple of minutes is to introduce the speakers and then to try to link, at least in my understanding, the themes of this panel to the first panel that we had yesterday. So try to find a kind of a continuity. And I'm glad to host as chair and discussant the young and the brightest. In a sense, I mean, we have a different generation from yesterday, we could say. And I think that we are into a real panel. I guess we are going to have a conversation among the three of them. So I'm going to introduce them in a row, okay? So the first speaker will be my colleague and friend from the Department of International Relations, Dr. Oren Barak. I can say also nominated our next chairman of the Department of International Relations starting October 1st. And Oren has a joint appointment at the Department of Political Science and at the Department of International Relations. So in a way, his work is somewhat intersectional, a bit like Ron, of comparative politics and international relations. Oren has his PhD from the Hebrew University. He's a senior lecturer, and I can foresee becoming quite soon associate prof. And amongst his many research projects, he wrote on the Lebanese army, regional actors and intrastate conflicts. He has a couple of books that he has edited and with Professor Gabi Scheffer that directly relates to the subject that Oren is going to talk, which is the civil security relations in Israel looking through the mirror. Okay. Our next speaker, coming yesterday from overseas, is Ronald Krebs, an associate professor from the University of Minnesota, PhD, Columbia University, 2003. And again, conducting research at the junction of international relations and comparative politics, dealing with international conflict and military service, and also dealing with the subject that he's going to talk, the nexus of democracy, war and conflict. Ron wrote a couple of books on those issues, Fighting for Rights, Military Service, and the Politics of Citizenship, Cornell 2006. And he is a co-editor in a recent book in War's Wake, International Conflict and the Fate of Liberal Democracy. And I'm glad also that Ron is going back to Minnesota, but will be joining us soon for the fall. He will be a visiting prof at our department as a Fulbright fellow. Last but not least, I want to introduce to you, and by the way, I mean, there's a slight difference in the title between the program, and he's going to talk about the flows of the Israeli democracy. What you have in the program is Insecurity, War, and Israel's Democracy, but those are variations on the same theme. Dr. Amir Lupovici, he's a lecturer at the Department of Political Science. He has a PhD from our department, and I regret that he's a host. He's a guest and not local. And Amir has written several articles dealing with issues of identities. He's a kind of constructivist, and he will tell us about that. And he's very much interested in different ways of looking at security from a different perspective. For instance, he wrote about different ways of approaching deterrence theory, and using constructivist methods to understand security and discourse of security. So again, he will be talking about this nexus among identity, security, and conflict. So we have a panel, and he's going to tell us about reading the Copenhagen School in Israel, so he will introduce to us what the Copenhagen School is. Okay, so just let me say a couple of words as chair or discussant, trying to link from reading your papers. I'm going to comment about the papers, of course, after your presentations. In a way, I found a direct link. And what is funny, I come from IR, and this is in a way, and I think that was the logic of the conference, that this second day, which is actually the first, in a way, the first day of the conference, we are looking inside out. And in a sense, all of you are reflecting in this concept of intermestic links between domestic politics and foreign policy that in a way was mentioned yesterday very clearly by Professor Nomi Hazan. So if I bring you back, for those of you who forgot or were not here, the themes that we had in the first session that had to do with Israel turning 64 and approaching the retirement age. So Professor Galnour started asking several questions regarding democracy and whether Israel is a democracy, and in a way Ron is going to reflect on that. Nomi Hazan presented us a very serious schism that we can see that driving here all the signs, what's going on, right, regarding whether there will be a law or there will not be a law, in a way legalizing or laundering the Bethel housing. So Nomi presented this schism between neo-nationalists and Democrats. And in a way, she related that to the conflict. And Benny Miller told us the different orientations of Israel's territorial goals from 48 and 67. I have not forgotten Alan, who started the long story 100 years ago, although it sounds very familiar, about the views of the first Aliyah settlers regarding international relations, the Arabs, the conflict, and so on. So what was in common, you might say, among those three presentations? Well, somehow we could say they could fit within the title state, society and foreign policy making. And in a way, we heard yesterday already probably the two key concepts that they are part of this dialogue that the three of us, or the four of us, or all of us will engage among democracy, security, and identity. That's the nexus, right? Because in a way, Nomi talked about democracy, and Alan talked about identity and security, perhaps less about democracy at those times, and Benny talked about security and identity. So the interrelation about these three concepts is probably the main theme that we are going to hear. So without further ado, I don't want to monopolize, and I had to set the example. I want to invite each of you to address the panel for about 20 minutes, no more. So then I'll try to, for a few minutes, to bombard you with several comments and questions, and then we'll open for discussion. So hopefully we'll have about half an hour for discussion. So Oren, bivakasha.
Good morning to everybody. Thank you, Arie, for your introduction. I'm going to talk about civil security relations in Israel. I call it looking through the mirror. Anyone following the journals, books about Israel can notice that in recent years there is a notable expansion in the study of Israel's civil security relationship, and resulting or emanating from workshops, conferences in many Israeli research institutions, the Van Leer Institute in Jerusalem, the INSS in Tel Aviv, and also the Davis Institute has organized a conference on existential threat and civil security relations, which I co-organized with Professor Gabi Sheffer, and we're grateful for the Davis Institute for this. The last development in this area is the establishment of the Association of Civil Military Studies in Israel in the Kinneret College later last year. It was December 2011. So something is going on. And something is going on also because among the people who are studying these issues, one can find not only sociologists and political scientists, but also economists and geographers and specialists in law and gender and environment and various other issues, and some practitioners. And also some of the branches of the Army are interested in that. So a whole bunch of people studying this topic, and I think that means something. And accordingly, one can find studies not only on political aspects of this relationship between the civilian sphere or sector and the security sphere, but also studies on the economic implications, cultural issues, the media, the educational system, the law, territory, the environment. I can go on, but I'll spare you this. But only few of these many studies engage in comparisons, compare Israel to other cases. And if one takes the inaugural meeting of the association that I just talked about, the Association for Civil Military Studies in Israel, if you look at the program there was only a handful of papers which had any comparative aspect in them or dimension. And I think this is a general characteristic of the literature. And what I'm going to do here is try to draw on those studies that do make comparisons between Israel and other cases and ask, using these studies, what is Israel and how the perception of Israel develops among the various approaches, and mention a few recent studies also. But the overall question here is, what is Israel and how does one describe its civil security relationship? So I'm looking for insight from the comparative literature. And the questions that I'm interested in, and I think are very important to the Israeli case, and were also mentioned in yesterday's panel, or alluded to anyway, are what's going on with the process of state formation in Israel, and specifically with the differentiation between the civilian sphere and the security sphere in the state. Is there an effective and not only formal civilian control over the security sector in Israel? By security sector, I mean mostly the military, but also the other security agencies. And what kind of relationship exists between Israel's pattern of civil military relations and the relationship between the various sectors in Israel, the Israeli Jews, the Arab Palestinians, and one can also talk about Greater Israel and include the Palestinians as well here. And I'll talk a little bit about the deficit in comparative works on Israel and why I think there is this deficit. I'll talk about the approaches to the study of Israel's civil security relations and how they make comparisons, what kind of comparisons they make. Then I'll mention a few recent studies on this topic, and I'll conclude with some questions, and I won't do more in order not to get in trouble with Arie, which I know is very strict on time. So as I mentioned, there are a few comparisons between, or few studies that compare Israel to other cases in this vast and expanding literature on Israel's civil security relations. And why is this the case? I think many students of Israel still view the Israeli case as unique, as one that is incomparable to other studies. This is one problem, as I see it. There's also the methodology of some of these scholars, mostly sociologists and anthropologists, those that do kind of deep, in-depth studies of the Israeli case, and they're either exhausted at the end of them or don't see comparisons as a useful tool in this case. And when there are comparisons between Israel and other cases, mostly the tendency is to make comparisons between Israel and Western states, the established states, the veteran states in the West, North America, Western Europe, and not to other kinds of states in the non-Western regions. And this also, I think, is a result of the literature, the general literature on civil security relations, which is a Western literature. It was developed in the United States, specifically Huntington and Janowitz and and all the rest, and their students, and these are Western theories that focus on the United States. And there's a whole bunch of literature on Western states, which is available to Israeli researchers. So that does make sense from this perspective. And also, and again, drawing on yesterday's panel, there is a kind of a bias in Israel, or kind of a perception that Israel is a Western state. Alan talked about that from the very beginning, that we are different from the locals, we are something else. We don't like the Eastern Europe too much, but we definitely like the Western Europe and America, and so we are kind of a Western case. So if we are a Western case, then it makes sense to look at other Western cases. So there's a kind of bias here, which I notice at least. And as I've mentioned, there are few comparisons between Israel and non-Western states, and especially not between Israel and Middle Eastern cases, for the reasons that have been mentioned yesterday, and I repeated them just a moment ago. And but the question is whether Israel is actually a Western state or not in terms of its civil security relations. And I think if we look at the issues that I've mentioned, the process of state formation, especially after '67, if you look at the literature on state formation, which highlights or emphasizes the differentiation of the instruments of government, the monopolization of the means of coercion, Benny talked about that yesterday. This separation between the civilian sphere and the security sphere, this is not very, doesn't exist in the Israeli case, or exists to a little extent. You can find that in the Israeli case. You can find that in some of the Western cases, but in Israel it's either in the making or completely absent. Effective control as opposed to formal control over the security sector, again, is very questionable in the Israeli case. This makes Israel comparable to non-Western cases. Not all of them, but some of them. And this intimate, I would say, relationship between the Jewish sector in Israel and the security sector, this whole issue that national security in Israel is basically the security of the Jewish sector, the dominant Jewish sector, also is not a very Western kind of perception of national security. So, and again, invites comparisons to non-Western cases. Now, let's very briefly go over the approaches to the study of Israel's civil security relationship and see what kinds of comparisons there are there. As I said before, not too many of them, but still some. The traditional writers about this relationship, the early kind of the founders of this subdiscipline, this area, they clearly had Western cases on their mind, theoretically and empirically. They were followers of Janowitz and not of Huntington, and they drew on that model of this kind of intermingling or what they call fragmented boundaries between the civilian and security sphere, but their perception of the Israeli case was as a Western case, maybe in the making or developing one, but a kind of a Western case. They talked about the integration of the IDF in Israeli society. They highlighted or emphasized the compulsory military service in Israel, the reserves forces as a kind of an indication for that. They talked about the partnership between the political and military elites. They talked about the IDF as a melting pot, as a national melting pot. And there were exceptions to that, of course. The most Arab Palestinian citizens in Israel, except the Druze and Circassians and some of the Bedouins, but also some Jews are exempted, and others, but they did emphasize the role of the IDF as a national melting pot. And this looked to them as a kind of a Western case at the end of the day, again drawing not on Huntington and his clear separation between a civil and a security sphere, but drawing on the works of Janowitz, who was describing and prescribing an integration of the military and society, where society is the dominant actor in this relationship. The critical studies, beginning with Yoram Peri in the early 80s, and others that joined them, were critical of the relationship between the civil and security spheres in Israel, but they still considered Israel as a kind of a Western case. But when you look at their terminology, for instance, Yoram Peri's book, when he talks about apparat control, this is an Eastern model, actually, of the party dominating, penetrating into the military. And he talked about Mapai in this context. So this was kind of a very provocative term, but again, it didn't change the entire picture of Israel being a Western case, maybe a problematic one, but a Western case nonetheless. The second critical aspect, well, it's even more critical than the use of this kind of terminology, was when they talked about the post-67 situation in Israel, and they described the erosion of effective control over the IDF and the security sector generally in Israel. And they talked about the territories and the South Lebanon and the whole security zone business and that, and they talked about the hegemony of the IDF and security affairs in Israel and national security generally. So this was the critical approach, the second approach. The third one, the new critical studies, these were, at the time, the most critical scholars of this relationship between the security and civilian spheres. They were part of this postmodernist trend in Israeli social sciences and generally in the late 80s and early 90s, beginning with Baruch Kimmerling, but also Uri Ben Eliezer and others. They rejected, especially Uri Ben Eliezer, reject the Western paradigm of civil security relations, which the previous approaches adopted, and the parallels between Israel and the Western states. But when you look at the comparisons that they made, they actually do compare Israel to Western cases, but states that had either problems in their state formation process or expanded or were revisionist, like France during the Algerian adventure, and these kind of cases. Also others were not exactly Western, like Prussia and Japan, but these were, I would argue that they didn't look too much beyond the European cases and try to find parallels elsewhere. Some of them did, or made notes along the way that suggested that such comparisons are necessary. For instance, Baruch Kimmerling talked about the IDF after 67. He talks about the IDF becoming essentially the same as tribal armies in various African states that assures the hegemony of one part of the collectivity's population and the subjugation of all its other parts. But he didn't develop too much that aspect. Some of these authors, like Egi Levi, talked about domestic or intra-communal aspects in the Jewish community in Israel, Mizrahis versus Ashkenazis, etc. But again, comparisons were made, especially with Western cases. Now, there's a fourth approach that talks about the existence of a security network in Israel, this informal policy network comprised of acting and retired security officials and their partners in various spheres in the Israeli state, in culture, politics, economy, and society, which is hegemonic since 1967. This is the approach that Professor Gabi Sheffer and myself are kind of pushing forward in recent years. And we go beyond the Western cases and look at non-Western cases, several non-Western cases, not across the board, but specific non-Western cases, such as South Korea, Singapore, Taiwan, South Africa, before the political changes there. These states who faced existential threats since their establishment and kind of built a civil-military relationship that was geared to address these existential threats. And in some cases was informal, like in the Israeli case. In some cases was more formal, like in the South African case. Some cases you had the civilians dominating this relationship, like Singapore, which was actually built on the Israeli model, their relationship, including the first strike and the preemptive strategy and all that. So there are variations among these cases, but we argue that this is the correct group, this existentially threatened small states, that Israel should be compared to. And there you can see parallels or developments in these states. Some have democratized, like South Korea and Taiwan and South Africa. Some have not, like Singapore, which is still authoritarian or partially democratic. and some is stuck in their formal democracy, like Israel, we would argue. And I think this whole issue of civil security relations is detrimental or extremely important when you talk about Israeli democracy and where it's heading, where it's been. And I liked the panel yesterday. It was very interesting and insightful, but this issue wasn't mentioned too much. Security in the concrete aspect, like the civil security relationship. And I think this matters a great deal when you try to assess or evaluate or make sense of the Israeli case. How much time do I have more?
1 minute and a half.
Okay. So I'll just conclude. I think there's something going on in the literature. I admit that I'm somewhat responsible for some of it, but others too, which kind of shift the emphasis or focus from Western comparisons, Western cases to which the Israeli cases compare to other kinds of cases, which raise new questions and insights about the Israeli case. I think this is a welcome trend, and I think I have more examples of more recent research. Maybe I'll talk about them in the Q&A, but I think this is very important in trying to really place the Israeli case not in an ideal kind of comparative setting, but in a more down-to-earth, concrete setting. And then you can try to think about what to do with Israel and how to improve and fix its flawed democracy, etc. Thank you very much.
Ron, your turn, explaining democracy's ebb and flow in Israel.
Thank you so much. Ooh, it's a little low for me. I'm especially grateful to the Davis Institute. As Arie mentioned, I'm going to be here in the fall as a Fulbright Senior Scholar. And I'll be not only in the Department of International Relations, but this was really facilitated by the Davis Institute. And so I'm especially grateful not only to be invited here today, but also for the opportunity to spend the fall term here. What I want to talk about today has to do with, as Arie put it, the ebbs and flows, that's the title of my paper, the ebbs and flows of Israeli democracy. If you look out in the literature, both scholarly and popular, you often see starkly divergent portraits of Israel's democracy. On the one hand, we're told that Israel is a vibrant democracy in which political contestation is rife, the press unruly, military officers would never dream of launching a coup, civil society is rich and varied, the Supreme Court independent and assertive, and so on. And this is all the more impressive, we are told, because Israel resides in an awfully nasty neighborhood. But there's, of course, a less pretty picture of Israel that is current as well, because in this Israel, socioeconomic inequality is rising, the scope of political debate is often narrow, the press subservient, the lines, as Oren said, between the civilian and the military sectors so blurry as to be irrelevant, a unified power elite rules the country, the Supreme Court, for all its talk, is mostly talk, that it largely blusters, and non-Jewish minorities suffer deep discrimination. In short, this portrait of Israel says that Israel's democracy is a sham for non-Jews and, to some extent, for all. On the pro-democratic side of the ledger lies a democratic political culture and the leadership of Israel's founders, perhaps buttressed by military strength and economic dynamism. And on the other side of the ledger lies Israel's enduring identity as a Jewish state and its unrelenting insecurity. And there is, of course, something, I think, to both these portraits, which is why both can adduce evidence in their favor, and which is why, in addition to its political overtones, the debate continues to rage. But regardless, I think, of whether one views Israel as a flawed liberal democracy or as an ethnocracy, to use two terms that are common, its regime has by no means been static over the nearly 65 years since independence. Its deviations from the liberal democratic ideal have waxed and waned, as has, frankly, the degree to which ethno-religious priorities have trumped. And so what my paper tries to do, and I'll try to lay out a bit in the next 20 minutes or so, is to explain these ebbs and flows of Israel's democracy, which, to my mind, quite surprisingly, has not been the focus of much of the literature. That is, looking at how do we understand the totality of the Israeli experience. Naomi Chazan wrote a lovely paper which really put a portion of that experience directly on the table, how to explain what's gone on in the last decade. But do the explanations that Naomi offers us, do they actually explain, tell us something about the broader pattern of Israel's democracy? So I try to do three things in the paper. First, simply to lay out a pattern. What are those ebbs and flows that we're seeking to explain? I won't say a lot about that, I'll just lay it out very quickly. Second, I'm going to deal with 5 common explanations. One, the definition of Israel, its self-identity as a self-consciously Jewish state. Second, physical security. Third, psychological or ontological security. Fourth, economic development or modernization. And fifth, globalization or global integration. Each of these explanations is very common in trying to explain this kind of variation, both in Israel and cross-nationally. And each of them, I think, might have merit in accounting for specific aspects of Israel's democracy or in specific episodes. But all of them, I think, are wanting as general explanations of the pattern. And I'm going to try to give you a flavor for the general argument that I prefer, which focuses on the fate of discourses of national exceptionalism. For it's these kinds of discourses of national exceptionalism which often, and not just in Israel, legitimize departure from liberal democratic ideals. The more events seem to bolster or render plausible such discourses, the less healthy democracy. And the more events render implausible or undermine such discourses, the more liberal democracy flourishes. And the key events that I would suggest that we should pay attention to in an insecure state like Israel are those that involve political military conflict with their adversaries. This is drawn, the larger theme of this conference is Israel in a comparative context. Oren's paper is a great example of that. This is drawn, I'll talk only about Israel, but this is drawn from a larger cross-national project examining Israel, the US, India, and France. Only portions of that are yet written, so don't ask me too many questions about it. But I have written about the US and France. That's part of the book on In War's Wake that Arie alluded to. Okay, so let me jump right in. What are the ebbs and flows of Israel's democracy? Now, on the one hand, this is crucial, because this is the empirical pattern that I'm hoping to explain. But I'd rather not spend a lot of time on it here, because frankly, it's not the most novel part of what it is I have to say. It is not uncontroversial or universally accepted, but as I said, it's also not novel. And so what do I think that pattern basically looks like? That is a pattern, I think, in which Israel's democratic regime, warts and all, was relatively stable through the early 1970s. But then in the mid-70s, changes in civil society, political culture, party politics, and state institutions bolstered contestation, notwithstanding persistent ethno-religious bias. But then, as Naomi Chazan put it yesterday, that Israel's democracy has come under great pressure in the first decade of the 21st century. This is not universally accepted. If you are a radical critic who says that Israel is basically an ethnocracy, or if you're slightly more moderate and prefer to call it an ethnic democracy, whatever term you prefer, basically Israel is once and always and forevermore a Jewish regime. Israel was born in sin from that perspective, and it remains in sin from that perspective. But also no variation to speak of. Second, you've got the view of Israel's apologists, right? That Israel is not once and always a Jewish regime, but once, ever, and always a robust democracy. And if it had flaws at the start, these flaws were steadily improved, steadily resolved and rectified over the course of Israel's 64 years. And that is a narrative, I think, in sort of Northrop Frye's terms, a heroic narrative of liberal progress. But then, since I like Frye, the third narrative is a narrative of tragedy. And that's the narrative we heard spoken about yesterday a little bit. The tragedy of Israel's democracy, in which 67 constitutes a key turning point. And there's something to that, of course. Yes, the occupation, I would argue, has been a stain on Israel's democracy. Yes, there has been bleeding across the green line because anomalous zones legally never remain fully anomalous. But we'd be hard-pressed to argue that Israel is more authoritarian in its politics and more systematically collectivist in its values, that it's been only increasingly so since 67. I think that's a hard case to make. And so my periodization, I think that any adequate explanation of Israel's democracy has to basically account for relative stability between 48 and the early 70s, progress between the early 70s and the 90s, and a regression since 2000. It is, of course, conceivable that different factors account for stasis and movement in each period. That might be, and we can't exclude that possibility either a priori or in this specific case. And it's a problem if we wish to develop a general explanation. But I presume, and I'm going to at least try that out in a kind of a playful way, that a general explanation is, by the principle of Occam's razor, superior. And so I want to see, is there a plausible general way that we can account for these kinds of broad dynamics? So what about the possible explanations that I think would be the ones that would occur to all of you? Well, by this standard, if this is the pattern we're seeking to explain, both Israel's self-definition as the Jewish state and the corrosive effects of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, that is, the factors at the heart of the radical and moderate critical narratives, fall short. They may have shaped, and they undoubtedly did shape, Israel's governance regime, but it's obvious that by their very nature, they cannot account for the broader observed patterns. What is, I think, very plausible is, of course, has to do with physical and material security, and this is the favorite argument of Israel's defenders. What other nation, we are often told, would, when confronting existential threats and when home to large and hostile national minorities, tolerate so much dissent? If the departures are greater in Israel than they are in other democracies, they aver, it is because the stakes are greater as well. And this, which implies a broader hypothesis that basically when Israel's been strong and secure, it has been more democratic. When it's been weaker and more insecure, it's been less democratic, follows a distinguished tradition in historical sociology that theorizes democracy as a luxury of the secure and describes authoritarian government as security pressures, per Otto Hinze and Harold Lasswell. And at first glance, this narrative, I think, would seem to be onto something. Because after the '67 war, and especially after Israel acquired nuclear weaponry, it was clear that Israel was more militarily powerful than its neighbors, and thus relatively secure. And you could say crudely it has since become more democratic. It became, for decades after that, more democratic and more liberal. And that stresses on Israel's democracy in recent years one might ascribe to a worsening security situation as a result of the failure of the Oslo process and the rising threat of Iran. The problem is that Israeli subjective perceptions of security and insecurity don't correlate with the nation's objective power. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol famously said, summarized for Lyndon Johnson in 1967, the bravado that coexisted in his nation alongside acute self-doubt. Samson the nerd was how he characterized Israel to Johnson. Even as Israel's perilous security situation gradually stabilized into the 1960s, its democracy did not experience dramatic changes. And certainly after '67, when hubris was layered onto or even replaced anxiety, one would have expected some progress, but little was forthcoming. In fact, Israel's democracy surprisingly began to advance in the mid-1970s and beyond, when conditions seemed less auspicious, when Israelis felt, after the fiasco of the 1973 war, especially insecure. And while Israel has since 2000 been increasingly isolated diplomatically, and while new threats loom, one is hard-pressed to argue in material terms that its military advantage over its competitors has really tangibly eroded. What about psychological, or what's sometimes called ontological security? Jennifer Mitton has argued that collectives need to maintain stable identities and that enduring rivalries can be functional to their production. And if we extend that to the organization of domestic politics, we might say that threats to the nation's identity would also give domestic actors incentives to reaffirm traditional narratives, to more rigorously police the boundaries of legitimate politics, and engage in more intense repression of alternative identity claims. In short, ontological insecurity undermines liberal and democratic institutions and practices, and ontologically secure states, in contrast, can afford to be more tolerant of dissent. The claim does resonate, I think, as an explanation for what has taken place since 2000, as these anti-democratic or illiberal measures are often justified as a response to the worldwide assault on Zionism. But greater Israeli, let's think about this in a broader historical sense, greater Israeli self-confidence and the reawakening of Jewish nationalism after '67 should have led to liberalization, but did not. The mid-'70s, from this perspective, were, of course, a time of deep insecurity, in which Israel was diplomatically isolated and politically dependent on the US as never before. In the 1980s, Israelis themselves began to question Zionist orthodoxies, and revisionist scholars reached the height of their influence in the 90s. So from an ontological security perspective, one would have expected Israelis after 1973, through the 1990s, to have circled the wagons, resulting in restricted political competition, narrowed scope of legitimate debate, a deferential media, and undermined civil liberties. Precisely the opposite, in other words, of what I think one observes. Let me leave off talking, in the interest of time, talking about economic prosperity, sort of modernization accounts, a la Ron Engelhardt, for example, and leave off talking about globalization. I think it's very obvious, and if you think about it for 2 minutes, you'll realize that this can't account for the broader patterns. And I want to talk about, instead, what do I think is going on here? I think what's going on is that what can account for this? All of the factors that I've spoken about are basically structural. But structural accounts overlook the process of political competition, which is where the dynamics of democracy are located. From that perspective, these material factors are very real and very important as bases for claims making. They are, if you will, the material stuff out of which actors craft rhetorical strategies to legitimate policies that can, on the one hand, deepen, or on the other hand, undermine or impoverish liberal democratic institutions and practices. Liberals and conservatives work very hard to harness developments in the economic and security arenas, whether desirable or undesirable, to their favored political agendas. And the fate of democracy depends on who can do so more effectively. The dynamics of democratic performance, in my view, thus rest on processes of argumentation among democracy's defenders or skeptics, whose claims rise and fall with both changing background discourses and the ways in which they intersect with real-world developments. Now, countless discourses swirl about the public sphere. Many of them have nothing to do, have much bearing on the fate of liberal and democratic institutions and processes. At the heart of democracy lies a discourse of equality, that the political community is a community of equals, that are equally entitled to take part in determining their collective fate, equally empowered to hold office holders accountable, and equally protected under the law. But equally defining of liberal democracy is not just that formal, official discourse, but a reality that is a useful fiction. For all sorts of inequalities, in fact, structure liberal democracies and their politics. Democracy is defined equally by the formal equality that it highlights as much as it is by the ways in which it de-emphasizes, ignores, and even occludes durable inequalities of political access, participation, and representation grounded in categories of class, race, ethnicity, gender, or religion. Israel is not alone in having these durable inequalities that are structured according to ascriptive categories. Much as Israelis like to think they're unique, they aren't. This tension between democracy's discourse of equality and its manifest inequalities has long served as the lifeblood of domestic reform movements that seek first to make their audience aware of these inequalities, second, to define these inequalities as violations of the polity's ideals, and third, to bring the polity's practices into line with its publicly articulated and widely accepted ideals. Democracies, of course, are not always, perhaps not often, receptive to these efforts to close the gaps between egalitarian ideals and unequal realities. But they are especially unreceptive, I would suggest, when narratives of national exceptionalism dominate the public sphere. Such identity narratives do not merely narrate the national self as in some fashion distinctive, as they must, for then there'd be no self separate of other, but as superior. And in so doing, they permit polities to depart openly from their ideals, and they impede the reflective self-criticism that reform movements demand. But when the public's faith in its own superiority and inherent rectitude is shaken, then polities can be awakened to the ways in which they may not be adhering to their own ideals. Therein, I think, lies the potential for what Samuel Huntington once called moments of creedal passion. For during such moments, he argued, existing structures of authority are called into question, democratic and egalitarian impulses are renewed, and political change, anticipated and unanticipated, occurs. In principle, of course, many experiences can be relevant tests of the expectations generated by narratives of exceptionalism. A lot depends on the terms in which the nation has been narrated, has been staged as exceptional. But wars are very commonly crucibles of national identity because military performance is often a test of these kinds of claims to superiority, and especially so for a state that has been and has often seen itself as being under siege, like Israel. When Israel's conflict experiences have reinforced a narrative of superiority relative to its designated others, typically Palestinians or Arabs, as I argue it did through 1967 and then again after 2000, its democracy has suffered at home and has proved resistant to reform. But when Israel's conflict experiences have undermined its claims to superiority, as I argue they steadily did piece by piece in 1973, 1982, and then the First Intifada, its democracy has been invigorated. Contestation has then expanded, liberal protections have strengthened, and calls for reform have been better received. Now, I've been warned that Arie is rather authoritarian when it comes to time, and he's threatened to pull out his taser on me. So I'm not going, and I figure that with this crowd, all I need to do is lay out that broad argument, and you all will think about how it is that it relates or doesn't relate to the experience. And whatever I said, you were going to argue with it anyway. And so I will leave the empirical details, perhaps. Maybe I'll just stop here and let others think about how that relates to their understanding of the Israeli experience, and I'll be happy to flesh it out further in the question and answer period. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron. Thank you, Ron. So we'll turn to the third presentation by Amir Lupovici, Reading Copenhagen School in Israel. Amir, bבקשה.
So hello, thank you for the invitation. I'm very happy to take part in this celebration, and I would like to take this opportunity to thank the Davis Institute for the generous support it gave me in my early stages of my academic career. Securitization literature is one of the fruitful theories in IR and has generated a large number of studies regarding various theoretical and empirical issues. However, the study of securitization processes in Israel has attracted a very limited amount of scholarly attention, with only few exceptions of studies that comprehensively explore such processes in Israel. The research remains marginal and anecdotal. One may argue that the neglect of studying securitization processes in Israel is quite surprising, given the fact that many scholars acknowledge the prominence of security discourse and of security practices in Israel. In this presentation, I aim to explain this puzzle. My main assertion is that the concept of securitization guides only a small number of studies regarding Israel, paradoxically, because of the prominence of security practices and discourse in Israel. I suggest that the interplay between the prominent security discourse on the one hand and the characteristics of securitization scholarship on the other has limited the ability and attractiveness of implementing this concept to explore Israeli security challenges. All the problems I later elaborate upon are not necessarily unsolvable problems in the theory, but rather challenges that can be addressed. Studying Israeli processes of securitization can help to sharpen and further develop securitization theory. Mainly, it points to the need to extend literature also to address traditional security threats and to consider different levels of insecurity. Since the 90s, a growing number of scholars have used the concept of securitization, originally developed by Copenhagen School, to denote the process through which different issues can be constructed as an existential threat, and thus removed from normal politics to mode of emergency. According to this theory, securitization is an intersubjective process that succeeds when the audience accepts the framing of an issue as an existential threat and supports taking extraordinary measures in order to address it. Crucial to this approach is the concept of security as a speech act, wherein the utterance of security itself is the act. As Oren Weaver argues, something by definition becomes a security problem when it is defined in this manner by the elites. In recent years, scholars have challenged the Copenhagen School's overemphasis on securitization as a speech act in a number of ways and have suggested seeing securitization as a practice. These ideas have been further elaborated by Thierry Balzac, who developed a sociological view of securitization that emphasizes the importance of practices, context, and power relations. I argue that securitization theory guides the study of Israel's security issues to a very limited extent, both in terms of the number of studies that elaborate on these issues and in terms of how detailed the discussion is. For example, while scholars provide interesting insights, they consider securitization in a very loose manner and in fact do not explore the exact process through which the issue that they study has attained the status of an existential threat. Rather, they present the narration of insecurity as an indication of securitization success. In other words, they tend to describe the framing of security and not the process through which the security framing is accepted by the audience. So why is it so puzzling? I suggest that lack of substantial bulk of research is puzzling for a number of reasons. Foremost, this is puzzling given the fact that Israel is considered to be a country with a prevalent security discourse and in which existential threats are often narrated. While the study of securitization in Israel is limited as shown above, the research on closely related issues is remarkably rich and extensive. In addition, it is puzzling given the fruitfulness of securitization theory, which has been successfully applied to explore processes of securitization in many countries in different regions. Furthermore, in recent years, some scholars have expressed the need to explore the Israeli case and have pointed to the lacuna in lack of sufficient attempts to do so, including Oren Barak and Professor Gabi Sheffer and many others that point to the need to study securitization processes in Israel, but not much work have been done in this regard. So I try to explain this puzzle. I argue that a main explanation to the lack of sufficient attention to processes of securitization in Israel results paradoxically from limitations of securitization theory itself in addressing a country in which the discourse and practices of security are prominent. But before addressing this explanation, let me briefly discuss two alternative explanations. One can argue that there is not much research of securitization in Israel simply because there are not many scholars who are familiar with or find it useful in explaining Israel's security issues. As for example, Jordan and others have reported positivism is dominant among Israeli scholars. Likewise, they found that a vast majority, 88% of the Israeli scholars, think that realism provides the most effective theoretical lenses to think of Israeli foreign policy. However, the dominance of positivist IR approaches should not be seen as a necessary constraint to the exploration of securitization. Jordan and others also report that around 16% of the Israeli scholars describe their work as constructivist. Furthermore, one should not be a constructivist in order to elaborate on securitization theory. Lastly, if the problem was only in how IR is approached by Israeli scholars, then we would expect that non-Israeli scholars would be more willing to engage with this concept. However, they also tend to avoid studying securitization processes in Israel. Regarding non-Israeli scholars, a main possible direction in explaining this puzzle is to point to the importance of the Copenhagen school gives to language, which make Israeli cases unapproachable to those scholars who don't speak Hebrew. However, while language and semantics of security were prominent in the early studies of securitization, as noted above, scholars have started to call for a more sociological view of securitization that is informed by the literature and on practices. Furthermore, attempting to explain the puzzle by scholars' familiarity with the Hebrew language is also not that convincing given the large number of studies on Israel's security conducted by non-Israeli scholars. While it is impossible to completely refute the above-mentioned explanations, I suggest that they at best provide only a partial explanation to the puzzle. Rather, I argue that the tendency to avoid implementing securitization theory to Israeli cases concerns the interrelations between the characteristics of securitization theory and the prominence of security discourse in Israel. On the one hand, securitization theory is limited in its ability and interest to explore securitization processes of a country with a quite permanent and deep perception of insecurity, which also blurs the meaning of securitization success. On the other hand, in the past, non-traditional threats such as migration and environment have not been successfully constructed as existential threats in Israel, partly because of the dominance of discourse and practices of traditional insecurity. Since securitization theories tend to focus on securitization success, these failed attempts have also been overlooked. I thus suggest that the prominence of security discourse and practices constrain the implementation of current securitization theories with regard to traditional and non-traditional threats of Israel. With regard to problems in addressing traditional threats, first, there is the tendency of scholars to implement securitization theories to study the success of framing non-traditional security issues as existential threats, while Copenhagen School researchers and their followers provided a general framework that can be applied to various kinds of threats, both traditional and non-traditional. In practice, most of the studies tended to focus on new threats. This fits well with the emerging European security discourse after the end of the Cold War, as well as it seemed more challenging than implementing the concept to explore traditional security issues. Put simply, studying the framing of security of traditional issues in a country such as Israel with a prominent security discourse where the audience is quickly apt to accept the security framing seemed less important. Second is the deep sense of insecurity, Israeli insecurity, which makes the study of securitization and securitization successes more difficult and less attractive. A number of scholars have looked into the deep structures of insecurity within Israeli Jews. Some have argued that insecurity is routinized and is constitutive to the Israeli self. From this perspective, it may seem that insecurity is the normal politics and at the most fundamental level. In such situations, one can wonder what the meaning of securitization success is. The non-traditional issues, such as environment and migration, were also not seen as attractive for inquiry simply because either they have been blocked by the prominent traditional security discourse and practices and therefore considered as securitization failures, or have been subordinated to traditional security threats. From this point of view, it is interesting to note that while in Europe, for example, migrants were considered as one of the main non-traditional sources of insecurity, in Israel they were seen as a solution to security challenges. In the early 90s, the Israeli government approved issuing working visas to foreigners in order to replace the Palestinian workers, which was part of the process of separation with the Palestinian. The characteristics of securitization scholarship limited then the ability to address these cases. First, securitization scholarship did not clearly operationalize securitization success and tended to avoid studying failed securitization attempts and to focus mainly on securitization successes. Second, unlike securitization theory that tends to see one issue of security as undermining the other one, the prominence of traditional insecurity and the subordination of threats in Israel to traditional security issues are used to enhance the basic sense of insecurity. For example, the securitization of Israeli identity as a Jewish state and as a democracy that emerged following the terror attacks of the Second Intifada were used to justify the erection of the separation barrier. Securitization theory that tends to see the emergence of a new threat as a mechanism that removes another issue from its existential insecurity through processes of desecuritization is thus limited in encompassing situations where new securitization processes aim to contribute to the continuing success of a former securitization process. So to conclude, I assert that securitization theories are not flawed and not fundamentally unable to deal with Israeli securitization moves. Rather, the contrary. I argue that securitization theories can prove useful in addressing Israeli cases, while implementing securitization theory to Israeli cases can contribute to study Israel's security. This might also help in theorizing securitization. I suggest that securitization theory should be more attentive to different types of existential threats. For example, there is need to differentiate between three stages: suggesting a framing of an issue as an existential threat, the audience's acceptance that the issue is an existential threat, and the audience acceptance of taking extraordinary measures to deal with the threat. This would allow considering changes even in a country with dominant discourse and practices of insecurity. For example, while a large number of Israelis have accepted the idea that Iran poses a significant threat to Israel, it has not always been the case. The case that they related this as an existential threat. A remarkable example is evident with Tamir Pardo, the current Mossad chief, who addressed exactly this issue, claiming that in 2011, claiming that, does Iran pose a threat to Israel? Absolutely. But if one said a nuclear bomb in Iranian hands was an existential threat, that would mean that we would have to close up shop and go home. That's not the situation. The term existential threat is used too freely. In this respect, the Israeli security discourse and practices demonstrate that an issue that has already been seen as a security challenge can be further securitized to allow taking even more severe means. In other words, it is not only how an issue moves from the politicized to the securitized, but how a securitized issue may become even further securitized and be perceived as existential threat that justifies taking extraordinary measures. Thank you.
So, you were extremely disciplined, which is good, so we'll have more time. So I try to stick to 10 minutes, so maybe you can terrorize me, Ron, okay? Just a couple of general comments, and then I want to refer to each paper separately. As I mentioned, this is an interesting panel, and I commend you, and I recommend reading the papers that you end by puzzling questions rather than coming with definitive answers. And again, the common theme has to do with democracy, security, and identity. And some of you are looking for patterns and comparisons, not just with the Israeli case, but with other cases. There's still an asymmetry. I would say that Oren and Amir, they move in the direction of a kind of historiography or sociology of knowledge, name dropping, whereas Ron is bringing a clear argument. We don't have to buy it, but it's a clear argument. So I guess within the panel it would be interesting to ask Oren what Oren thinks about what Amir said and what Amir thinks about what Oren said. Okay? So let me move directly to each of you and suggest some questions or comments. Oren, you asked three very important questions, although in a way the paper reads like an introduction to a volume or comparing, or because you don't come with clear answers, right? So it's in a way setting the agenda following what Nomi and Professor Galnour said yesterday, playing with the idea, which I think it's a common theme in this conference, whether the Israeli case is unique or it can be compared, right? And you argue for the need to comparison and to think outside of the box, leave the Western model, think about third world countries. You know, you can listen to my accent, so you could add to the list, why don't compare that to Latin American cases at some point? As you have an article I read from the CV, and I remember Pedatzur, and I remember the late Benjamin Aktzin, and the three of you said, in the Israeli case, it's not clear whether Israel has an army or the army has a state, right? And that's a crucial point that might explain some foreign policy, right, which is the main theme of today's panel. You mentioned securitization in your paper. I'm not sure whether that's the term that Amir uses. So in a sense, it would be interesting to ask what you mean by that. And you seem, Oren, I mean, you mentioned that there is a clear difference between ideal types and paradigmatic types and the reality. And again, you leave us, you know, some suspense here about the purpose of the exercise, because by the end of the day, the paper is telling us that we should learn from comparing Israel to other cases. And it reminds me our late teacher, Arkavi, that used to say the better way to understand the Arab-Israeli conflict is to leave it, move away from it, and that's part of the mission of the Institute, right? Learn about other cases and then come back and compare, right? So excellent questions, but in a way you set the agenda here, right? You don't provide the answers, but perhaps that's not the purpose of the exercise. Okay, Ron's paper. Ron's paper, as I mentioned, you come with a clear puzzle. You address Galnur's question. It seems that the two of you coordinate somehow. You also address Nomi, because you talk about those two Israelis, as Nomi has two Israels, very different views, and you seem to play among discourse, democracy, and security. Okay, so you are trying to explain democratic dynamics. You come with 5 alternative explanations that you seem to refute, and then you come to your thesis. I quote page 17. Democracy has suffered when external events have seemed to make possible to sustain narratives of national exceptionalism, and you should explain what do we mean by that more, which might be hubris, arrogance, whatever, and has rebounded when external events have seemed to render implausible or weaken narratives of national exceptionalism, right? That's your thesis. It's clear. Then it gets dense, very dense and baroque in the discussion, pages 17 and 21, about the logic of that discourse. And I'm trying, I mean, I think that this is a very interesting argument, and you say you could compare that to the US, to India, right, to France. So you seem to imply that when a country gets in trouble or in a conflict, that it doesn't come out of that conflict, it might make the country more humble and more democratic, right? In a nutshell, in my own words. So in a way, conflict experiences or security might lead to more and less democracy, right? That's the argument, and I commend you for that argument. The question again is when we play with empirics, whether it plays that out. Second Intifada, I think it was quite shocking for us. Did that make Israel more democratic? I'm not sure. Second Lebanon War, although you have the Vinograd report, did the second Lebanon War that, again, punish Israel in terms of hubris? The comparison with the Yom Kippur War, I think it's a bit far-fetched, but still, in the terms of the discourse, did the second Lebanon War make Israel more democratic? I'm not so sure about that. So you seem to imply, that's my final comment I have to keep to time, is that we need a bar war with Iran. Hopefully we'll survive, and then we'll be more democratic, right? That's what you seem to imply. I don't know. Okay. Finally, Amir. Again, it's a very interesting paper. I know that in a way you are a constructivist, or, well, I don't know where you have the tag. I'm a constructivist, right? But in a way, you seem to bring this securitization theory. And the question, and you know me, I might be a bit blunt. Why is this important? I mean, there seems to be a gap, and you say, between the theories and the realities and the practices. That's why I wrote to myself, I really want to ask Oren to comment or say something about what he thinks, because it seems that there's a lot of practice here in Israel about securitization. And I mentioned, you know, my good friend and colleague, Professor Alan Doughty. He coined a term, and I don't know how many of you are aware, but I sell Alan's term to all my students, and the term is called Geval syndrome. Okay, Geval syndrome, for those of you who don't know Yiddish, it's the syndrome of the catastrophe. And it's the Israelis' tendency to make any security problem an existential threat. So that, I think, it's more or less what you're telling us, right? Securitization. Although, again, it's interesting, again, this is an exercise in sociology of knowledge, and it's nice you quote me there. I'm part of that by telling what IR scholars we do, right? But the question is, and you mentioned Uriel Abulov dealing with that, or I remember a wonderful sentence by David Grossman about the sense of insecurity that we have in Israel, right? And Uriel worked on that as well. So the question is, can we take that theory, right, of securitization that takes environmental issues or other issues and apply that to the Israeli case? And just the last point to stick to my 10 minutes comments is that if you look today, you mentioned migration, but if you update your paper, you look what's going on now in the last few weeks, in the discourse, in the way we are approaching the issue, and again, how we frame that. Nomi mentioned asylum seekers, right? Refugees, illegal infiltrators, right? So it seems that you can now play with the case study, because at least in the discourse now, that we completely ignore the Palestinian case because it does not exist, right? Quote unquote. So then the focus is on the demographic threat of 60,000 people from Sudan and Eritrea threatening the existence of Israel as a Jewish state. And that also seems to be securitization. Okay, I rest my case. So we have plenty of time. Okay, so what we can do, I guess we can wait for the audience and then you can collect and reflect on my own comments. So we are going to collect questions, comments, and try to be pointed as staccato as I try to be. Okay, I gave you the example. So say your name, point your question, we collect a few, and we might play for a couple of rounds, right? Because we have about half an hour. So we start with that, and we move to the center, and then to the right. Yes, okay. Professor Alandauti.
Thank you for the publicity for Kacowicz syndrome. I have one brief comment for Ron. First of all, the paper is very thoughtful and largely persuasive, but in my simple-minded way, I couldn't help wondering about demography. You have a huge Sephardi influx after the state is formed. They come to political maturity in '77, which I've labeled as a breakthrough of society, that particular upheaval. You have differential birth rates between sectors of the population. Everybody assumes a Haredim are multiplying much quicker than anybody else, true or not. And then you have this huge immigration from the former Soviet Union, which I think undoubtedly has a terrific political impact. And it seems to me that at least some of this correlates with the ebbs and flows that you're talking about.
Okay, thanks. Your name, sir?
Yeah, I'm Stefan Stetter from the University of the Bundeswehr in Munich.
Welcome.
Thank you very much. I have two comments. This was a very interesting, excellent panel. One to Amir. I think one of the reasons which you might want to add in your consideration why securitization theory hasn't been applied to the case of Israel, or not so extensively, is that if you look at securitization scholars, most of them are not country specialists. So it comes by chance that if they are country specialists, they would look at a country, but most of them look at it from the perspective of regional security or global security. It would be interesting exploring whether most of securitization scholars, I mean, they would pick certainly the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, this would be the case, but you could explore is whether this conflict is more perceived of, something taking place in the domestic arena of Israel-Palestine rather than being an issue of regional or global concern, because I would guess that this is one of the reasons why securitization theory hasn't looked so extensively at this conflict, which everybody of us would say they should have probably have done that. And on Oren's paper, I thought that was very interesting, and I also would like to add another. Barak, you said it's from the introduction of.
Well, it sounds to me, I don't know. You have to tell us.
I had another explanation which more looks like the Jeremiah point of looking at the whole international, embedding that in the whole international scene. And this is the English school. I would like to bring in the English school here, because if you look at civil state or civil military relations, I would guess that it would be worth looking at those English school scholars which have looked at the entry of specific states into international society. And there have been many who have argued that it's a very fragile position for many states which entered international society late or entered it from the periphery. Cases like even Russia. Ivan Neumann has written about it last year in Review of International Studies, a very fragile case with complicated civil or state military relations. The cases of Japan, Suganami, or I would think in particular of Turkey would be interesting cases. All entered international society. They have legitimacy as states, but it has been a fragile position because they entered international society not from the core, but from the periphery. And I would assume that there's some half dependency on how this plays out in civil military relations. So comparing Israel with other states, strong states in terms of their military capabilities, like Japan, like Turkey, like Russia, but entering international society from the periphery would be an interesting point too. It would situate your explanation also within a broader IR theory.
Okay, thank you very much. Professor Wayne Miller.
Thank you, Arie. Very interesting paper. I mean, is basically your argument that military defeat increase the level of democracy? Just wanted to make sure. This is the argument. Germany and Japan after World War II. On the other hand, Germany after World War I was the opposite case. Russia after World War I, and in different ways, the defeats of Iraq, I mean, led to different kind of outcome. So I think you have to, you have to look at the broader set of cases, and then it might refine.
But the answer is no, so then the whole premise is faulty.
Hold your horses. Okay, we turn to the middle section. Professor Hillel Fritsch.
Okay, I'm very much biased. Of course, I come from the second.
Don't be biased, be academic.
I come from the second image reverse theory. That was Ron's second theory that he tried to demote. So I have three comments. Well, one problem is with the dependent variable. How in any way do you see Israel less of a democracy today, let's say, than the semi-Bolshevik, Ashkenazi-dominated Israel of the 50s and 60s, where everyone was invisible except for secular Ashkenazi left-wing people? I mean, it's only a claim that at Hebrew University that could have any value. My second query is, how do you know your discourse theory is the intervening variable and the realist, more second image reverse is not the independent variable? I mean, how do you know that discourse, what are your tests for proving that it's really discourse that basically informs Israeli democratic conventions? And my third, I didn't write it down. I have
Okay, Professor Yael Aronoff, please.
Yeah, I thought all three papers were really thought-provoking. I just had a couple questions and comments for Ron and Amir. And first for Ron, it seems like I don't know if it would be helpful or not, again, to maybe further define exceptionalism and maybe talk about civic nationalism versus ethnic nationalism, and where you think, and Israel seems to, in many cases, to be a hybrid, and when it veers towards one end of the continuum to another is what feeds or not into your argument. It also seems the way you break it up that you're looking at the period, perhaps, of most polarization in Israeli society as the most democratic, for instance. In the aftermath, ideological heated differences after the '67 war, where you have the most polarization. Although Naomi Chazan was pointing to polarization in some ways today, which is true. In some areas, in terms of foreign policy and other things, there's less polarization, perhaps, in Israel. So on some issue areas, one could see your period as the most polarized, which you seem as most dramatic, which is something kind of that might be interesting to think about. And then in terms of comparing your two papers, I'm not sure if, I was trying to think whether your two papers are in some sense complementary or contradictory. Because on one hand, you're saying Israel has a superiority complex today, or most Israelis do, and you're saying they have an insecurity complex. And of course, the two can go together, but they might also contradict one another, that if you're very insecure, that actually the driving force is a feeling that you're superior to everybody else. But in both cases, you seem to be kind of veering towards almost national character, things that anthropologists did in the 1950s that have become more outdated since. And on the one hand, you're looking at variation, but on the other hand, you're both claiming that Israelis in general have these general attributes that motivate things, and you might unpack them even more in terms of ideology. So I like the way you unpack different kinds of existential threat, and I think that's really useful. But you might look at it, well, in both cases, do different ideologies have more or less ethnic nationalism? Do some ideologies have more or less kind of senses of certain kinds of existential threat? So if you look at Barak now, who doesn't think Iran is an existential threat, coming from a labor ideology, and Netanyahu coming from a Likud ideology who does see Iran as an existential threat, are there differences there among Israelis that one has to unpack? And then, some polls show that most Israelis perhaps don't see Iran as an existential threat, or at least don't want to attack Iran without a green light from the U.S. So you might question those certain assumptions about both communities as well. And I have some other comments I'll talk to you afterwards.
Thanks. No, we might have second round. Professor Ramsila.
setting an agenda, I think there is a missing dimension here, which continues the missing dimension of last night or yesterday. And this is what goes on around Israel. And I don't think it's irrelevant. And especially when it comes to similar processes of securitization on the other side. Take, for example, the vision papers of the Israeli Arabs. And what it did, not much echoed in Israeli discourse, but it was just another step in what seemed to be, at least to many Israeli scholars and people who are interested in majority-minority relationship, as another element in the growing threat to Israel's ethnic security, namely the issue of majority. Okay, and I in this context, I join Hillel's comment that we can't put all the eggs in this basket called securitization. There is also a reality that has a role in influencing how people feel, because discourse eventually has to mobilize audience. If you want to mobilize audience, you have to relate to their feelings, to their emotions, to their fears, and many times these fears are real. And I take you to the late 90s and early, definitely the period of the Second Intifada, where the whole idea of what is security changed. During those years, the idea that Israel was under threat almost disappeared. Or actually, you can go back to even the peace agreement with Egypt, after which the whole idea that the Arabs can constitute any threat to Israel's very existence disappeared. But the problem became much more specific for every individual, because it transformed from a threat to the state to a threat to every individual. When you could go on the street and get somebody stabbing you in the back. Remember these days when there were individual terrorist attacks of people who were never mobilized or never ordered to do something. And this is of course something that aggravated and became much more prevalent during the 2000, during the Second Intifada. So I think it would be important to take into consideration also the what's going around Israel, both in terms of discourse and reality. And the question of how to combine these two dimensions is the main problem, as we all know, but we have to relate to them.
Okay, let's say Gali and Gabi.
Oh, and just about why the literature compares to Israel to Western cases. Of course, I know very little about this, but maybe there's also a normative twist there. It's not just we believe we're Western, but this is the reference point we want to be looking at. So there's a normative statement there as well. Also following something Arie said, before. Sorry.
For the.
Can you say something about what you think are really the main variables on which Western and non-Western cases vary? You know, is this like a scale that you could show from Western to non-Western? And what are the main variables that you're comparing on? And finally, I'm wondering if there's an empirical twist to this. You know, the comparison is really something that's been done also in the States. We talk about the new states. States that are building their civil security relations are looking at other cases to learn how to build them. So the comparison is both from within when they actually build these relations and reshape them and reform them, and from the outside for us as scholars. So there's like a double comparison there. And for Ron, I was wondering, I am curious about the other cases. Pick one, you know, because I'm trying to figure out whether this, for Israel, the national exceptionalism is related to the Jewish identity. And I'm trying to understand for myself the role of, you know, the Jewish part, the religious part How important is that in shaping a certain type of national exceptionalism? How different is that from the American sense of national exceptionalism? That seems important in order then to really disentangle what happens after major military defeats. That was the thing that everyone wanted to, sort of figure out. Thanks.
Again, advertise Alan Doughty, who wrote about the Jewish origins of Israeli foreign policy, and that's something to keep in mind.
I want to make a very short comment, a very general and short comment. Many people tend to forget the very basic fact that Israel was never an effective democracy. Israel was and is a formal democracy. And it started already during the Yishuv period, even before the Haganah and the other people who were connected to the security factor, were part of the game. And this is a very basic kind of factor. And this basic factor, you can see it now with all those who say, we are the sovereigns. You know who is the sovereign in Israel now? The prime minister. He said, I'm the sovereign. Members of Knesset say that they are, the sovereign. Even some bureaucrats in the Ministry of Finance and other ministries says, we are the sovereign, And this is the basic fact, very basic fact, which led to the securitization and to the emergence of the importance of the military factor in Israel.
Thank you, Gabi. Kim Bibi and other sovereigns, right? Okay. Your name, please, and ask the
I'm Merav Amir, and I have a question both for Ron and for Amir. First, for Ron, you talked about the perceived security and the perceived exceptionalism of Israel, but you never talked about the perceived democracy. And I was wondering if you can also, because when you talk about levels of democracy, and I'll add to other questions that were asked before, I was wondering how you measure the levels when democracy is comprised of so many different factors that are quantifiable and some of them are not, and so I'm wondering about this aspect of perceived democracy. And the other question for Amir, I really liked your the way you talk about the fact that processes of securitization are not do not work according to binary distinctions between politicization and securitization. There are intensifications and de-intensifications. But the question is also, can you think about securitization as operating on multi-level aspects and not only on the question of intensification, because it is obviously comprised of other dimensions as well.
Okay, so that. Okay, we have about 12 minutes. So okay. Last one.
Yeah, last one. Yeah, I'm Kumar Swami. I'm not making the academic statement, but probably trying to share my experience. And I lived in Israel during the 90s. So I was unable to follow with that. When you feel more confident and more democratic when the situation is more secured or otherwise, I'm unable to follow the link. But my personal experience was still about mid-90s. I could freely go anywhere I wanted without ever worrying about carrying my passport. But towards after the 1996 terror and everything, when you travel in the bus, you always feel that, no, do I look like a Palestinian or an Arab? And I feel a little bit, nobody checked me or anything, but the body language felt me that maybe I'm looking suspicious. And it's both ways. And an Israeli traveling next to me was a little uneasy, but me sitting next to him, and he could find that. But that was not the case in the early part. I was almost, are you an Indian? People just came and asked me. But gradually I began to look more like a Palestinian than an Indian. That's more a reflection of the realities on the ground. So I'm not so sure, how do you explain this? Is the security for more secure or less secure, which is more visible in the 2000 onwards. But if the situation, not just in Israel, in the wider region, that's what Avraham was saying. It's not just only a question of within Israel, in the wider context, when you're more acceptable, and everybody becomes Ham Shalanu. Otherwise, even the guy who knows you for 20 years looks slightly different. I think probably you need to take a much larger rather than only within the Israeli situation. Thanks.
Okay. You changed the rules of the game. You have about 3 minutes each of you. I suggest that we reverse the order. So we start, Amir, with you. Okay, you can take that from there, from the podium.
Okay. Do you hear me? So thank you for the question and the comment. I wouldn't be able to. I have 3 minutes. Are you?
Yes.
Yeah. I wouldn't be able to address all, but there are very good comments. I also start by reverse order for the question of Mirav. There's some paper now on macro securitization and meta securitization, which might fit well with the Israeli meta securitization, and I think this may be the way to approach these issues. But I'm not sure that these are still detailed research that can be. It needs further research on the theoretical issues of what does it mean meta or macro securitization, because it's just they just presented it.
Amir. We'll do like in basketball, don't worry. Okay.
Okay. Then there was some question, I think Yael and Avram asked about the sources of the securitization, what brings the securitization, which is a very important issue as well. And I think this is some of the reasons that make, especially what you suggested, one of the reasons why the scholar didn't study securitization. It seemed, okay, there's threats, and they believe in these threats, and they are very meaningful threats. So this is obvious that people will start accepting the framing of insecurity. But it's not only that. There's various factors that affect the securitization process, especially of non-traditional issues, such as environment, for example, which I think it was one of the main issues that the Copenhagen school explored, but there was not much study on that issue on Israel. Mainly, partly because of these attempts were failed. The attempts to securitize this issue, but this is also a very promising way to further develop both the ideology and what the other side does as a way to elaborate on securitization literature. So this is what this alludes to Arie's question. I think the Israeli case is very promising to, as many other suggested. I'm not original in this argument that Israel is a very promising case for the securitization literature. And for example, you asked about what is going now in South Tel Aviv with the refugee asylum and so on. It's very interesting, and this is something that is changing. While I was writing the paper, it became an issue that was securitized, and in Israel, this kind of issue were not successfully securitized before. And it's very interesting. For example, there was the Secretary of the Cabinet, Gideon Hauser, in Yoman a few weeks ago, and he tried to argue that the fact that we now he didn't, of course, use this word, but the fact that we are securitizing now the refugees doesn't exclude the Iranian threat. The Iranian threat still is an existential threat. And this is very interesting from the point of view of the theory of securitization, because in securitization, you would expect that when a new threat emerges, then the other one disappears. And Gideon also were very strict to emphasize that is not the case. That in Israel, we can have multi-securitization processes simultaneously. And lastly, so I again think this helped to address the question why it is important. Also, the Gewalt syndrome is very interesting, because the question is why or how it comes a syndrome, also in both levels, of the macro securitization level and of specific issues that successfully becomes such an existential threat. So the question is, how come an issue, and this alludes again to these different factors that allow to the process to succeed. So I'll stop here. Thank you.
Okay, Ron? There's far, far too much, and I hope that we'll have an opportunity to talk about it in sort of over coffee and beyond. Let me just say sort of a few words. I have here 6 points. I'm sure I won't get through all of them. The first has to do with the fact that I clearly made a strategic error in not actually presenting any of the empirics, because that led to some misunderstandings. Right? As I said, I think reasonably clearly early on, let me be very clear about the pattern, painting with very broad brushstrokes, because all theory requires stepping back a little bit from sort of, this is like a little bit like pointillism, right? So, of course, stepping back and taking a look at that big Sunday in the Park with George painting, right? And in that big painting, I think, and this may lead a little bit to Hillel's point, in that big painting, I was certainly not laying out the period of the first 20 years as some kind of democratic nirvana, which is what you often hear on the part of the left, right? That's certainly not the case. Semi-Bolshevik, I'm not sure, but certainly it was no nirvana. And again, so what I'm characterizing is Israel as certainly deeply flawed in those first 20 years, but relatively stable in the sense that you don't see a lot of change. Change from the period of post-73 through the mid-1990s. I think, Rasmus, you're capturing some of the developments that begin to take place in the late 90s. You very accurately described those. That's perfectly consistent with the broad pattern that I was laying out, but which reaches its full flowering in the wake of the Second Intifada. And what I was suggesting, and this is where Hillel was giving me sort of the hardest time, is what's the relationship between these real events and the way in which those events get narrated? And what I'm trying to do is to break down those dichotomies, not to say it's discourse versus material stuff, but rather how do we go about narrating those material realities. Let me take a step back, and I'm going to try, so now that I've sort of clarified that a bit, I want to make sort of two broad points, actually. One is something we didn't come back to, which Arie raised, which is, I think, a slight bit of a false dichotomy that takes place in our conversations, which is, Arie, as you put it, is Israel unique or is it comparable? And that's a false dichotomy. Every country is unique, yet resides along a continuum. That is, it occupies a unique space on that continuum, whatever continuum we're interested in. It is a unique configuration that is that polity, but it is nevertheless comparable. And I think it's we get sort of wrapped up in this unique versus comparable. A true discourse of exceptionalism in fact, says that you are not comparable along any continuum, that you are not part of a continuum, that you are an off the equilibrium path in every conceivable dimension, right? And it is revealing, perhaps, that both America and Israel, which share sort of a covenantal tradition, a notion of a brit, right, a notion of a city upon a hill, and or la goyim, these are different terms from our different traditions, both the Protestant tradition in America and the Jewish tradition, of course, in the context of Israel. Both hold out both also have long subscribed to deeply exceptionalist visions of the self. Third, to Gabi's point on formal versus effective, this is something to discuss much more. But of course, along many dimensions, many democracies are merely formal democracies. C. Wright Mills, now more than half a century ago, famously wrote of the power elite. And there have been countless studies, including one, and very good one done in the APSR a number of years ago by my colleague Larry Jacobs at the University of Minnesota, which show that, in fact, American foreign policy is basically what the big business interests want, right? That, in other words, that may be, And it may be that, of course, democracy is always attenuated, and especially representative democracy is attenuated. But that does not, in some sense, prevent us from talking about the ways in which the degree of effectiveness, the degree of responsiveness may shift, and it may be that we are nowhere near that ideal type, but yet the differences may be quite meaningful in terms of the quality of democracy. Three, if I can, just because I have so many. 1 minute. All right. Let me sort of, okay, so, all right, 1 minute. All right. Alan Dowdy, demographics. Clearly, demographics are important. And obviously, whenever there are a lot of, and I think there's some truth to what you say, but here's why I'm going to tell you why I think it's not the whole story. There is a lot that goes on in the 1970s and the 1980s that you've written about very eloquently. That is not simply a matter of the rise to political maturation of the Mizrahim, right? First of all, the Mizrahim are by no means liberals, by any stretch, right? And they vote for Begin, right? And, but yet we also see major transformations in the media, and the much less deferential media, major transformations in political institutions, major transformations in the role of the Supreme Court, none of which have anything to do with demographics, as far as I can tell. Maybe there are interesting connections that I'd be interested in hearing about. But if we're talking about purely in terms of political mobilization, there may be something to that. But there are so many other dimensions to the ways that are going on that, again, I'm interested in the larger complex that I don't think demographics can capture. Similarly, the immigration from the former Soviet Union that allegedly drives some of the recent illiberalism, the latest polls of the IDI show that, of course, A, there are very few differences among the younger generations of immigrants of the FSU between them and other Israelis. Secondly, Yisrael Beitenu draws only about half its support from immigrants from the former Soviet Union, and of course some of the most recent illiberal moves have nothing to do with that. This is a much broader-based development that I think it's hard to ascribe. So we're dealing here with large complexes of changes that are not simply linked to attitudes toward liberal values on the part of particular groups. And the final point, which came up a couple of times, is this just a story of military defeat? Right? A question I've gotten a couple of times. Now, this is very important. And I confess I don't have all the answers, and that's good because it means there's some more research for me to do in my career. Clearly, in the wake of military defeats, we sometimes get stab-in-the-back narratives. This is the story of Germany after the First World War. This is the story, by the way, in the United States, among the military after Vietnam. And on the part of the right, Reagan has a stab-in-the-back narrative, basically. That the tragedy of Vietnam was not that we got in, but that we left. Right? And that it was really Johnson constraining the military and so on. So when do stab-in-the-back narratives take hold, and when do stab-in-the-back narratives not take hold? I don't have a fully clear answer to that yet. Although I will point out that the very fact that you're nodding along, Benny, which means that you think that this is important, tells you that this is not just a pure realist story. Because it can't be. It can't be. What I will say is that the story that I'm telling, at least in the Israeli context, and also the American context, is not only about defeat. Because a lot of it has to do with why has something even come to be seen as a defeat in the first place? We can easily narrate the 73 war could have been narrated as victory. And there were those who wished to narrate it as victory, and in some operational sense, arguably the victory was greater than in 67. Trevor Dupuy has shown this with data. The 82 war is not, it's in and of itself a defeat. It's a defeat because of how the Israeli body politic reacts, not because of what's going on the ground militarily. And so, in order to understand those dynamics, and that's what my work speaks to understand those dynamics, we need to understand how those events on the ground are intersecting with narratives of national superiority.
Oren, last word. Okay, I have an impossible task because I have challenges from Arie and I need to comment on another paper and your questions, so I'll try to do something here. Yeah, securitization theory I think is limited with regard to the Israeli case, but also generally I think it's a theory of discourse. And it's an actorless theory. I mean, where's the actor? Where are the people who securitize? And what is the community? Where's the audience? And I think in these two respects, the Israeli case is a bit suspicious or a bit problematic in this regard because you have a very powerful actor securitizing, which is the security network as I see it. And you have an audience which is, the very idea that an existential threat could be something imagined and not real is unthinkable in Israel. So when you have a receptive audience and an actor, which are very important, that kind of, for me personally, shifted me from purely discursive analysis to looking at the actors and the context and the structure, of course, of the dramatic change in '67 and all these new areas which the military dominated. So that's one point. Now, commenting uninvitedly on Ron's paper, I mean, one of the things that I should have mentioned or emphasized is this: there are many comparisons between Israel, not only to established states, but to great powers or large powers, like the United States and France, and you can add India here as well. But where are the small states? Okay, and this is one of the problems. So, in your project, I mean, you're not looking at any small state, but maybe you should, and because you have Lustig's very powerful argument about Britain and Ireland and Algeria and France and Algeria, and then his conclusion is that Israel would do automatically what the two other great powers have done. But I would argue the reverse, because it is small, weak, a newcomer to the international community, as has been mentioned here.
Israel's weak, really?
Well,
Yeah.
This is part of the Israeli narrative, that Israel is somehow weak. Israel is a regional power. It's the
as
most
I've mentioned,
economy
it's not,
and military. It's a bizarre
But it's
statement.
not the United States and not France. And in terms of perception, it is weak and fragile. In terms of consensus, even to move some houses from one spot to another, I mean, there's the lack of decision there. So this is another point. This is indeed a transitional paper. I've done some research on comparing Israel to some cases, which I've mentioned, and I'm going to compare it to more cases. And the question is, which kind of cases? And now I'm thinking of cases of non-Western states. That's clear from my talk. Not great powers. It's clear from my comments now. But the states that have expanded tried to swallow other areas and ended up being not quite the same states as they were before, and or with a sizable ethnic community, a minority within them. And Turkey and Lebanon are two good cases here, especially Lebanon, but also Turkey in some respects. And how did they cope with this kind of multi-ethnic reality, where the idea of the nation state is so pivotal to the state from its beginning? Now, about the question of, is Israel similar to newcomer states? Well, it isn't, because Israel sort of re-entered the international community after 73, with many states broke up their relations with Israel. It was an entirely different story after 73, with the boycott and all that. This is one point. The second is, in Turkey, you see all these steps to limit the power of the military. Some of them are due to the EU, the aspirations to join the EU and be a part of Europe, either formally or informally. And here you don't see this effect. I would argue maybe even the contrary. The military aid from the United States buttresses the position of the security sector and not the other way around. About Israel as a formal democracy, I agree with that before '67. Hillel, I mean, you're painting a very kind of dark picture. Remember the abolition of the military government and its reinstatement after '67 in the territories, and now it's kind of spilling over into Israel itself. And one could give other examples. And the last comment, I think, is we're completely behind schedule, but to Avram. I mean, this whole notion of existential threats, after 77 and 78, 79, the Egyptian, there's no Arab coalition, but still there's this perception of an existential threat. And the two sources that you mentioned are the Palestinians in the territories and the Palestinian Arabs in Israel. And these are two good cases for a securitization theory, I would argue. How does a demand for power sharing, point by point after live powers, we have a grand coalition, mutual veto, and proportional representation, all that. How is this framed as an existential threat? I mean, it's very difficult to see. And how does this whole situation in the territory become existential threat to Israel. I mean, Israel controls the territories and not the other way around. So these are, so there you would need to add other theories than the kind of positivist perception of threat, that there was a threat before 77, but it's gone basically, even more so after 2003, but still, you know, this perception is there. I'll stop here. Thanks.
Okay, I want to thank our three panelists. I want to thank the audience, and we have a short break now, right?